A series of emails that showed a tangled web of lies would put one son under the spotlight for the murder of his own father. And what seemed to be the smoking gun was that his own mother identified him as the attacker. However, once the mother was firm in recovery, her story changed. Her memory had lapsed and she actually had no idea who had murdered her husband. But there was one thing she was certain of, and that was that her son was innocent. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a YouTube or podcast version in the description box down below. It was 10:30 a.m. on the 15th of November when a call came in reporting that Peter Porco hadn't showed up for work. It was extremely unlike him, and so an officer, Officer Hart, agreed to go and do a welfare check and make sure everything was okay at the Porco's family home. Peter lived there with his wife Joan, and his two adult sons Jonathan and Christopher had moved out since they were adults, but they were back regularly, or as regularly as they possibly could be. Jonathan was on active duty in the Navy, and Christopher was deep in his studies at Rochester University. The work colleague who called in that Peter hadn't showed up at work already tried to call him at home but got no answer. Officer Hart arrived at Peter and Joan's house, and he could see that there weren't any cars on the drive. He called the home phone from inside of his car, but the phone just kept ringing and there was no answer. Officer Hart then decided he should get out of the car and have a scout about. As he approached the door, he reached his hand out and knocked on. He waited and waited, but no one came to answer. And that's when he looked more closely at the doorknob and saw there was a blood smear on it. And as his eyes moved down, he noticed 2 or 3 red drops of blood on the porch. Officer Hart tried on a whim to open the door, assuming that it was probably locked, but it wasn't. He twisted the handle and the door opened. After that, his eyes darted to a figure on the floor. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he could make out that there was a man lying at the bottom of the stairs on his right side with his shirt pulled up. His eyes were open and his face was covered in blood. That was the officer's cue to leave. It was clear that this man was dead and he didn't know what else he was going to find in that house. So he shuffled out of the house and called for urgent assistance, including backup. Less than 4 minutes later, a number of other officers arrived and they all headed inside. Once inside, they found clear signs of a struggle. Officer Hart was the first inside the kitchen, and then he went through into the bathroom and into the living room, and then finally the basement, where he found a dog. He'd heard a dog barking earlier, but it was only now that he could actually see it. And it seemed fine. It was uninjured and actually just wagging its tail, seemingly happy to see someone. Meanwhile, the other officers continued to clear the rest of the house, and Officer Hart joined upstairs, where he was the first to enter the master bedroom. He saw a woman lying in the bed, and there was an axe lying next to her. The entire room was speckled in blood, with the bed sheets drenched, and on closer inspection, the woman lying in the bed moved her head, and so EMTs were called in to see if they could save her. The woman, soon identified as Peter's wife, Joan, was found to have devastating injuries. The EMTs found Joan's blood pressure to be 70/0, which paramedics later said usually meant death. She had a 4 to 6 inch laceration running from the top of the right side of her forehead to her left eye. She had another 4-inch wound from where her left eye should have been to her nose, and her brain was actually exposed, and there was a deep cut on the left side of her mouth where her jaw was no longer connected. She also had a number of teeth missing. The EMT then saw that Joan was moving her legs a bit and he asked her to try and stay still. It was at this point that one of the lead investigators, who knew the family home from having previously responded to a burglary call, this detective also knew that in the family there was Peter, the man they'd found dead, Joan, the woman they'd just found close to death, and 2 adult sons. The detective asked Joan if she could hear him and she nodded that yes, she could. He then asked if a family member had done this, and she nodded yes. He asked if Jonathan had done this to her, and Joan immediately shook her head no. He then asked if her other son Christopher had done this, and Joan nodded yes. The EMT then repeated the question and asked if Chris had been involved. Joan then moved her head and her hand up and down, indicating that yes, he had. He needed to confirm what Joan had just indicated. There was no telling if she was going to make it or not, so the EMT asked the questions again, and Joan indicated once more that Chris had done this to her. A be on the lookout was immediately put out by police for Christopher. The details were that he would be driving an 04 Jeep Wrangler and to use caution because he was possibly armed. Back in Rochester, Christopher had called his friend Sarah at 2 p.m, at this point apparently unaware that the attack had even happened on his family home. On this 2 p.m. phone call, he told his friend Sarah that he was feeling unwell and specifically that his stomach was queasy. It was just a short while later that Sarah got a message from her sister saying that something had happened on Brockley Drive, where she knew Christopher's parents lived. Christopher said he was nervous because he hadn't been able to get in touch with his mum or dad all day. At 3:09 p.m. that afternoon, Christopher called police. He told them that someone at Times Union newspaper had called him and they'd told him about the attack. And so he wanted to know what was going on, but the operator said she didn't know and so she needed to put him on hold. Now eventually she did pick up again and she asked for his address and information and said she'd call him back. The operator noticed that Christopher seemed calm. Just an hour later he was back on the phone and a detective spoke to him, asking when the last time he saw his parents was, and Christopher said it was about 3 weeks ago, but he couldn't remember exactly. With that, Christopher was brought into the station and he was taken into an interview room to be questioned. He told the investigator that on the night before his parents were found, he'd had dinner with his fraternity brother Marshall at around 9:30 p.m. Marshall had then dropped him off at his Jeep by 10:30 that evening. At 12:45 p.m. the following afternoon, so on the 15th of November, Marshall came back from class and saw Christopher watching TV in the lounge. Then, a little after 3 p.m, Christopher told Marshall that someone on his street had been killed, and that's when his mobile phone rang. He was told there and then that his father was dead and his mother was in a really bad way. Police had to look into whether it was actually possible for Christopher to have committed the crime. He gave his alibi as having been asleep in the lounge area of the fraternity house, but the last known sighting of him there was the night before. No one actually saw him back there until the following morning, well after his parents had been discovered. The investigating team looked at the route Christopher would have taken, and knowing that he had a noticeable yellow Jeep, they decided to look into whether his Jeep showed up at all on that route on the evening of the 14th of November or the morning of the 15th. CCTV footage from the university was sifted through, and they did find a yellow Jeep travelling through the parking lot just after 10:30 p.m. That Jeep was seen to be similar to Christopher's, and a forensic video analysis found that the mud on the Jeep in the video matched the mud found on the Jeep when it was brought in for testing. Unfortunately, they couldn't see the licence plate, so they couldn't confirm for sure that it was Christopher's Jeep, but they carried on looking at that footage and comparing it to the Jeep they had in for testing. And there was a spot on the back of the vehicle with what looked like an oval sticker. And this wasn't standard for this Jeep, it was a very specific add-on, and it was an add-on that there was on Christopher's Jeep. On top of this, there was a toll booth on the route Christopher would have taken from Rochester to Albany, and so police questioned the booth workers from the times he would have passed through. One of the workers saw a yellow Jeep come through just before 2 a.m. on the morning of the attacks. She remembered it so specifically because it was travelling so quickly. The toll tickets put the Jeep arriving in Albany at 1:51 a.m. and returning to Rochester exit at 8:18 a.m. that same morning. The journey from Rochester to Albany would have taken around 4 hours, and one of Joan and Peter's neighbours told police they had seen a yellow Jeep that they recognised as Christopher's. They'd seen it parked outside of the family home in the early hours of the morning of the attacks. What I do need to mention about this case is that there is some pretty shoddy police work going on. It's really frustrating because the things that they do, it actually could have blown the whole case. And it's not just shoddy from what the suspect, Christopher, has said, but also from a number of other sources, a number of other people. Whilst Christopher was in that interview room, his attorney was right outside, desperately trying to get in. His attorney was a family friend who had just happened to hear about the attacks and that Christopher was the prime suspect. And so he had actually called up police and told them to wait before questioning Christopher and that he was on his way right now. The attorney arrived at the station, but he was told that Christopher had waived his right to counsel. But the attorney knew that this technically was impossible, at least legally. He couldn't make that decision without his attorney present. And Christopher never actually did waive his right. He says that he thinks he needs a lawyer a number of times in his interview. The investigating team found that the Porco's family home alarm system was activated at 9:54 p.m. on the evening of the 14th of November, and then at 2:14 a.m. it was deactivated using the master code. They also found that the phone line that was accessible from the back garden had been cut at 4:54 a.m. Nothing appeared to be taken from the house. The expensive china and crystal was still in the dining room, and all of Joan's credit cards were still in her purse. The reason, the motive for this attack, was very clearly personal. The investigating officers found that there were different blood patterns found on the floor of the family home, as well as on the walls and in the bed, and that the blood was so prevalent in the bed that it was clear the attack could only have happened there. There was more blood about the house, but the majority was in the bedroom, and any blood outside of the bedroom appeared to be from transfer or from Peter moving around after he'd been attacked. I started reading a book about this case, and it was only at this point in my research that I realised that I had heard of this case before, and that's because there is a very distinguishable moment or event in this case that I just have never forgotten, and that's the fact that Peter, after he had been attacked, he went about his normal morning activities. Now, this was much before he would have usually gotten up for the day, but he literally got out of bed, walked down the stairs. He started to do his normal morning routine, including going outside to get the paper, getting the milk for his cup of tea or cup of coffee. And then he came inside and collapsed at the bottom of the stairs, which is where he was ultimately found. Because of the brain injuries he'd suffered, he actually was able to do all of this and just had no idea what was happening or how badly injured he actually was. There was blood spatter on the wall and on a lampshade which showed the killer had stood on the left side of the bed where Joan slept as they swung the axe. It also showed that there had only been one person who had physically done the attack. They found lots of fingerprints belonging to Peter and Joan, but just one identifiable fingerprint matching an outside person. And this was found on the basement door, and it was theorised that the fingerprint belonged to the person who had shut the family dog in the basement. And that fingerprint belonged to Christopher. Of course, it's not completely out of the question that his fingerprint would be there. He did live there when he wasn't at university, after all, but either way, police placed this as potential evidence. To be honest, the main reason the police had honed in on Christopher in the first place was because Joan had identified him, but this wasn't as straightforward as a normal piece of witness testimony might be. The type of injury Joan sustained to her frontal lobe was complex, and the neurosurgeon said that after surgery, some memories could be lost. But that didn't necessarily mean she wouldn't have any memory of the attack. They'd just have to wait and see. Joan went in for life-saving surgery, and miraculously she did survive. But this is where things became complex for the police investigation. Joan was questioned again by police, and she said that she had no memory of the actual attack. She remembered that a few days before the attack, she'd gone to the YMCA, she'd worked on her lawn, and she'd gone to church. But the next thing she remembered after that was the final few days of her hospital stay after the attack. She had no memory of what actually had happened, but she was absolutely certain that her son Christopher would never have committed the brutal murder of her husband, his father, and the attempted murder of her. It is really difficult. This is a woman who's just lost her partner of 30 years and is potentially about to not only lose her youngest son too, but if she does, she may have to believe that he actually had it in him to murder his own parents. It's almost impossible to understand. I cannot comprehend what this woman must have been feeling, but either way, the police were certain that even if Joan herself didn't have memory of her son having done this, they knew that he had, and they believed that they could get the evidence to prove it. And this evidence started with a number of emails that they'd found between Christopher and both of his parents. The book I read had loads of these emails in, and What's evident is just how untrustworthy Christopher is. He's an extremely competent liar, and he lies for no reason. A lot of the emails are basically his dad saying that they've had letters come to their address, stating that a loan hasn't been paid, for example, or there's yet another unpaid parking ticket, or tuition hasn't been paid, or even that Christopher's grades are so bad he's being taken off the course. But every single time, and without fail, Christopher emails back excusing his behaviour, saying that the letters are mistakes, someone's just made an administrative error, or the cop that pulled him over didn't actually give him a physical ticket. Whatever it is, he excuses it, he just lies about it. Christopher had applied for a car loan in May 2004, and he was approved based on the 2 guarantor signatures, one for Christopher himself and the other for his dad, Peter. There was also a $31,000 student loan with Peter's signature on it, but Peter's work colleague of 25 years, who had seen his signature perhaps thousands of times over that period, she said that the signature on the loan forms definitely wasn't Peter's. It was a forgery. Christopher had also told his parents in this series of emails that the university was giving him a semester for free because they'd lost an exam. That was why he'd had that letter saying that his exam results were so low and that he was going to be getting kicked off the course. But a university official later confirmed that that was not true. The emails that Peter sends to his son are heartbreaking. He clearly finds it so very difficult to believe what Christopher has done in terms of the lies he's told and in terms of the money he's basically stolen through forging co-signatures for them. But Christopher is an expert at manipulating the narrative to convince his parents that everything is fine and that it's all a big misunderstanding. In one of the emails, Peter's just found out about one of the forgeries, and he says that if this happens again, then he'd be forced to file forgery affidavits. Quote, "Things are obviously spinning out of control with you. I think you should come home so we can talk. We may be disappointed in you, but your mother and I still love you and care about your future. We can't help you problem solve without information and input from you, Dad." Peter tries to get Christopher to speak to him on the phone over and over again, but Christopher always has some kind of an excuse. Either he tried to call but got no answer, or he was just too busy. One time, he says that his friend went to the hospital, so he couldn't possibly find 5 minutes to call. Eventually, the case did go to trial. Joan and Peter's oldest son, Jonathan, had been cleared immediately because he was in class at Navy School on the 15th of November. Given the distance to his parents' home, there was just no way he could have been able to be present when the attacks were happening. Christopher confirmed his alibi as having been out with his fraternity brother Marshall the night before his parents were found, and said that he stayed over in the lounge of the fraternity house on the sofa before waking up and going for a jog in the morning. The issue with his alibi was that no one had actually seen him between about 10:30 p.m. on the evening of the 14th and lunchtime on the 15th. Marshall was called to the witness stand and he answered a question from the prosecution, saying he didn't know Christopher to be a jogger. He'd never seen him jog, especially in the morning. And a number of other students were called to testify. They confirmed that they also had never seen Christopher jog either, and none of them remember seeing him in the lounge that night. The prosecution wanted the interrogation tape to be played at trial, but the judge refused to allow this. We know that Christopher's interrogation was completely unethical and illegal because of him being refused a lawyer. So I actually think the decision to not allow that tape into trial is fair. I couldn't believe the details of the interrogation. It really is awful. And to be honest, it's just dangerous police work. It really could have fucked up this whole trial for everyone involved, especially the victims. At trial, Christopher's lawyer argued that the majority of evidence the prosecution did have wouldn't have even been a thing if they hadn't done that interrogation, or if they'd done the interrogation correctly. The prosecution's case was based on the things Christopher said in the tape. Even if the actual recording itself wasn't allowed in, it didn't matter. They argued that there wouldn't have even been a case if that botched interrogation hadn't gone ahead. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there very much still would be a case. There's a lot of evidence that came from outside of that interrogation. There was ample physical evidence, for example, and lots that connected Christopher to the crime itself in terms of circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is still evidence, but I do think this is an example of incompetence that could have had very real consequences. The next thing to establish was how the perpetrator had gotten inside the house. We know that the Porcos had a really good house alarm system. A year before the attacks, Joan and Peter were shocked to come home one day to find their house had been burgled. They filed a police report, and an officer took a look around the house, noting that 2 laptops had been stolen, including the one Joan used for work. But there wasn't a whole lot the police could do. No one was ever arrested for the crime, but Joan and Peter did decide they wanted to put in this alarm system after that. Now, I read a couple of sources that suggested that the burglary was actually Christopher's doing. I couldn't find out how they'd confirm this, but it was said that Christopher went on to try and sell those laptops online soon after the burglary, but he wanted to make a bit more money and sell those laptops more than once, so he never actually shipped them after he'd taken the buyer's money. Instead, he waited as long as he could before emailing the very unhappy buyers back, saying that his brother had passed away and that's why he'd been unable to actually send the laptops. So Joan and Peter had installed this home alarm system because of that burglary, and the only people who knew the code were Joan and Peter, their 2 sons, Jonathan and Christopher, and their close family friends, an Uncle John and a friend, Margaret. The prosecution presented that the alarm would pretty much always be set at night, and any door opening, even the inside ones, could set off a beeping tone as a warning that the alarm would shortly go off. But as long as you knew the code, you could deactivate it easily enough. The Porco's eldest son, Jonathan, was called to testify, and he said that yes, both he and his brother knew about the alarm system, they knew the code, and also said that he and his brother knew that they were beneficiaries of their parents' will. And he went on to describe how he and his brother's relationship recently had been very strained. Christopher's aunt testified about how both Joan and Peter were worried about their son once he went off to college. He had stopped being communicative, and they were concerned about his studies and about how much he'd started drinking. And then one of Peter's work colleagues was called to testify. This woman, Julia, who Peter had worked with for over 25 years, said that in the months leading up to the attacks, Peter had started to slightly change the way he spoke about Christopher. And then another colleague, Michelle, spoke about how Peter literally said he thought his son was a psychopath. And Michelle said that this kind of comment was totally out of character for Peter, but that he absolutely was being serious. One of Christopher's friends, who he had an internship with, said that Christopher told him that on his 21st birthday, he was going to be gifted $2.8 million. This was, of course, untrue, but the prosecution alleged that he was expecting to come into a large amount of money from his parents' life insurance policies after he'd killed them, and that's why he said that he was coming into all that money. The trial continued on, and finally, Joan was called to the witness stand. She testified that she'd experienced significant memory loss. When Joan was on the stand, she spoke quietly. It was really noticeably quiet. When she was asked why this was, she said it was because her throat had been damaged so badly in the attack. Heartbreakingly, after the attack, Joan found herself asking both Christopher and Jonathan where her husband Peter was. She often forgot that he'd been murdered right beside her. She also said, quote, "I believe the person or persons are still out there. Were they after both Peter and I? It's scary for me." Despite the police saying that they'd looked into other leads and just not found anyone else, the defence found this wasn't exactly true. There were a number of other incidents of witnesses coming forward, calling in with potentially legit information, and they were just ignored, or the officer said that they'd be called back, and then they just never were. All of this came out at trial. They had, however, looked into one person, and Peter had been threatened over a decade before the attacks by someone he'd basically worked representing children in cases in family court. And one of the children's dad had threatened Peter. And this made both he and Joan so concerned for their own children's safety that at the time they'd even taken Christopher and Jonathan out of school for the day to assess what to do. But this man was looked into, and it was found he'd swiped in at a high-security military building where he worked at 7:02 a.m. on the morning of the 15th, and he was at home before that, so he just never could have been the attacker. The defence presented that there was someone Joan had told her son Jonathan about in the lead-up to the attack. An unknown person that she'd seen in the driveway just a few weeks before the attack had walked up, and in doing so he tripped the motion sensor lights. Now, as soon as those lights flicked on, that person walked very quickly away. Joan didn't have any more information, and so the police said they just couldn't look into this. Another thing the defence pointed to was that there was no blood evidence found on Christopher when he was picked up by police, or in his yellow Jeep. This, they said, would have been impossible if he'd been involved. Given the amount of blood the victims lost and the brutality of the attacks, it just wasn't something that was likely. But the prosecution argued that this was simply because Christopher was an excellent cleaner when it came to getting rid of blood. He previously worked as a vet, and his main body of work would be to clean up blood after surgeries. Finally, with regards to Joan pointing at her son as the attacker, the defence argued that Joan's blood pressure was extremely low and that this may have affected her orientation when it came to nodding that Christopher was involved in the attack. But even with the defence's case, the prosecution's case was much stronger with genuine evidence against Christopher. Ultimately, it didn't take the jury very long at all to decide on their outcome. They found Christopher guilty on the attempted murder charge and on the first-degree murder charge. He was sentenced to the maximum of 50 years to life in prison, and that was 25 years for each charge. Joan, however, just couldn't accept the verdict. Quote, "I know my son, and he could not have committed these very violent acts, and I wish the court to continue to find the person or people who did this to us."